dad looks at me the way you look at a bill you forgot to pay, not angry, exactly, just tired of dealing with it. I was 28 years old and I still felt like a problem he hadn't solved yet. His name is Warren, my dad. He retired early from a career in civil engineering, which meant he spent a lot of time at home with opinions about everything. My posture, my car, my career choices, the way I loaded the dishwasher. My older brother, Thad, was a cardiologist at 32. My younger sister, Becca, had just made partner at her firm before she turned 30. And then there was me, the middle one, the one who left a perfectly good job at a consulting firm to go build furniture in a workshop I rented for $400 a month behind the tire shop in Columbus. My mom, she's kind, genuinely kind, the kind of kind that makes everything worse. She used to cover for me. He's finding his way, she'd tell people. Like I was lost. Like I was 17 and failing algebra, not an adult human being who had made a deliberate choice. I've been making furniture for 3 years when my brother announced his engagement. Her name is Courtney. She works in interior design, runs her own studio in Chicago. My brother met her at a conference on sustainable architecture. She was polished, confident, the kind of person who walked into a room and rearranged its energy without touching anything. My family loved her immediately. The engagement dinner was in December. My dad had rented a private room at the kind of steakhouse where the menus don't have prices. My brother sat at the head of the table next to Courtney. My mom was already crying before the bread arrived. My sister was on her third glass of champagne, glowing. My brother-in-law Mark was taking photos on his phone. I sat at the far end of the table next to my Uncle Pete, who was mostly deaf in one ear and talks loudly about fishing. For the first 40 minutes, no one asked me anything. That sounds like I'm keeping score. I'm not. Or maybe I was, a little. It's hard not to when you've been invisible for so long that you start measuring the invisibility just to confirm it's real. At some point, my dad raised his glass and said something about legacy, about what it means to build a life. He looked at my brother when he said it. He looked at my sister. He did not look at me. My mom said, quietly, across the table, "We're so proud of all three of you." She said it looking at her wine glass. I ate my steak and listened to Uncle Pete explain the difference between largemouth and smallmouth bass. Here's the thing about woodworking that nobody in my family understood. I didn't fall into it. I chose it. Carefully. Deliberately. After 2 years of sitting at a desk in the glass building helping pharmaceutical companies optimize their supply chains, I came home one night and sat on my kitchen floor for an hour because I couldn't think of a single reason to get up. Not a dramatic crisis. Not a breakdown. Just a complete and total absence of anything that felt like mine. I'd always worked with my hands. My grandfather, my mom's dad, who died when I was 19, had a shop in his garage. He built birdhouses, cabinets, rocking chairs. He smelled like sawdust and coffee, and he never once asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. He just handed me a piece of sandpaper and said, "Feel the grain." So when I quit the consulting firm, I wasn't running away. I was going back to something. I started small. Cutting boards, small shelves, side tables. I sold them at a farmer's market on Saturday mornings, standing behind a card table with a handwritten sign that said, "Harvest Woodworked." I made $1,100 in the first 4 months. My rent at the time was $1,400. I did not tell my family any of this, not because I was ashamed, because I already knew what they would say, and I didn't have enough energy to argue with it while also figuring out how to survive. My dad found out I quit the consulting job when my sister mentioned it at Thanksgiving. He didn't say anything that night. He called me the next day. "You understand what you're throwing away?" It wasn't a question. "I understand what I was giving up," I said. "That's different." Long pause. "Your grandfather would have told you to get a real job and do woodworking on weekends." "Grandpa built his own workshop," I said. "He never worked for anyone else a day in his life after 42. Another pause. Then, "Call your mother more." He hung up. That was a year before the engagement dinner. In that year, things had changed for me in ways I hadn't told anyone about because I was still figuring out if they were real. A woman named Petra, not Petra from some list, but a real person, an architect I'd met at a local craft fair, had commissioned 3 pieces from me for a showroom she was redesigning on the north side of Columbus. Custom shelving, a conference table, and a reception desk built from reclaimed white oak. I spent 6 weeks on those pieces. When I delivered them, she walked around each one with her hands behind her back. Very quiet, and then she said, "How backed up are you right now?" I told her I had a 2-week window in March. She said, I need you for a project in Chicago. Full kitchen build out, custom cabinetry, one of my biggest clients. I'll pay you what you're worth. I went home and sat in my workshop for a long time after that. The Chicago project took 8 weeks. It was the hardest work I'd ever done, not physically, but in terms of precision, problem solving, holding a vision in my head while also holding a hand plane. When it was finished, Petra's client posted photos on Instagram. Interior design accounts I'd never heard of started reposting them. Someone messaged me asking if I took commissions. Then someone else. Then a dozen more. By the time December came, I had a waiting list of 4 months. I had just finished a second Chicago project, a residential library for a family in Lincoln Park, floor-to-ceiling built-ins in quarter-sawn white oak with hand-cut joinery. I had just turned down 2 projects because I didn't have the capacity. I had not told my family any of this. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't a strategic silence. It wasn't some long game where I was waiting to reveal everything at a dinner party. It was simpler and more embarrassing than that. I didn't think they'd believe me. I didn't think they'd understand the difference between making furniture and what I was actually doing. And somewhere underneath that, I think I was afraid that if I told them and they still looked at me the way my dad looked at me, I would feel it more sharply than before. So I said nothing and I went to the engagement dinner and I sat next to Uncle Pete. Sometime around dessert, my sister started talking about a renovation she and Mark were planning. Kitchen update, new flooring, maybe an addition eventually. My brother-in-law mentioned they've been looking at custom cabinetry and the quotes were insane. My dad said you can get perfectly good prefab from any big box store. Nobody can tell the difference. My sister laughed a little. My brother nodded. I looked at my bread plate. Then Courtney, my brother's fiancée, the interior designer, said, actually, custom's worth it if you find the right person. The craftsmanship is completely different. My dad shrugged. That's an expensive hobby for the homeowner. Courtney tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they're deciding whether to push back. It's not a hobby when it's done at that level. I specify custom millwork on most of my projects. The right maker can transform a space. My mom, probably trying to smooth things over, turned to me and said in that gentle, careful voice, didn't you say you've been doing some furniture work, honey? The table didn't go quiet. Nobody turned toward me with expectation. My dad picked up his coffee cup. My brother checked his phone briefly. My sister reached for her champagne. Yeah, I said, a bit. Courtney looked at me. Not the way my family looked at me. Not patient, not tired, not waiting for the subject to change. Just looked at me, directly, with the full attention of someone who was actually listening. What kind of work? She asked. Custom furniture, I said. Built-ins, cabinetry, that kind of thing. What's your shop called? Something in my chest got complicated. Harvest Woodworks. The room was still just regular dinner noise. My brother was saying something to Mark. My dad was adding sugar to his coffee. Courtney had gone very still. She said, the library in Lincoln Park. It wasn't a question either. I said yes. She set her fork down. She looked at me for a moment, the way you look at someone you've been trying to reach on the phone for weeks, and they suddenly just walk in through the front door. My colleague did that project, she said. She will not stop talking about it. She showed me photos in October. I looked up your website. She paused. You don't have a contact form anymore. I took it down in November, I said. I couldn't manage the volume. My mother was looking at me. My sister had put her champagne glass down. Courtney said, we have been trying to find you for a project in Evanston, a whole home renovation, significant scope. My colleague submitted your name 3 times to the client. The client actually flew to Columbus to see your workshop last month. The table was quiet now. I said, that was a guy named Foster? Salt and pepper hair, came with his wife? Courtney said, that's him. My dad had put down his coffee cup. I said, I haven't sent him a contract yet. I was going to reach out after the holidays. My brother was looking at me, not the checking his phone look. Actually looking. My dad said slowly, how long has this been going on? The business, 3 years. The Chicago work, about 8 months. Why didn't you say anything? I looked at him for a moment. There was a version of this conversation where I said something pointed, something that landed. I had run through those versions in my head before, not at dinner tables, but in my workshop, when I was planing a board and my mind went quiet enough to rehearse old pain. I didn't say any of those things. I needed it to be mine first, I said, before it was anyone else's opinion. My dad looked at me. My dad has a face that does not give much away. 40 years of engineering precision, nothing wasted, nothing decorative. But something crossed it then that I hadn't seen before. Not pride exactly. Not yet. Something earlier than pride. Something that looked like recalibration. My mom reached over and put her hand on my arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. My sister said, "Can you do our kitchen?" Everybody laughed. The tension broke and floated away, and the table became a dinner table again. Courtney leaned over to my brother and said something quiet. He nodded and looked at me with the expression of someone who has just realized that a familiar road goes somewhere he hadn't noticed before. I stayed another hour. Uncle Pete told me about a fishing spot on Hoover Reservoir. My mom kept touching my shoulder when she passed behind my chair, the way she used to do when I was small. My dad didn't say much for the rest of the night, but just before we all moved toward the coats, he stopped beside me and said, "We should come see the workshop." Just that. No apology, no grand reversal, just a door opening. "Any time," I said. I drove home on 270 with the heat on and the radio off. It was late and cold, and the freeway was nearly empty. I thought about my grandfather and his garage shop, the smell of it, the way the light came in through the single high window in the afternoon. I thought about how he used to say that wood remembers stress, that if you force it, it will find a way to move, eventually, when conditions change. The only thing to do was understand the grain and work with it. I had a 4-month waiting list and a house renovation in Evanston and a name that someone had tried to find 3 times. I had built something out of patience and sawdust and years of quiet work while my family watched from a distance, not seeing it. I don't know what changes now. Maybe everything, maybe less than I think. Families are like wood that way. They move slowly, they carry their history inside them, and you can't force them into shapes they're not ready to hold. But that night, pulling into my driveway, I sat in the car for a minute before going inside. I thought about the Lincoln Park Library, the way the light had hit the quarter sawn oak at a certain angle in the afternoon, making the grain ripple like water. The client had cried a little when she saw it finished. Not dramatically, just stood in the middle of the room and let her eyes fill. I thought, this is what I chose. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I needed anyone else to see it to make it real. It was already real. It had been real the whole time. I used to think the hardest part was the work itself. The early mornings, the cold workshop, the months where I wasn't sure I could cover rent. But looking back now, that wasn't hard at all. The hard part was doing it while people who loved me were quietly convinced I was failing. Is a particular kind of weight that comes from being doubted by your own family. It doesn't announce itself loudly, it accumulates. In a look across the dinner table, in a question that doesn't get asked, in the way my dad would talk about legacy while looking at my brother and my sister and let his eyes skip past me like I was a word he'd already read and forgotten. I carried that weight into my workshop every single day. And I made a choice not once, but over and over, not to let it be the thing that defined the work. That choice, to keep going anyway, to stay disciplined when nothing external was rewarding me for it. That's the thing I want to talk about, because I think people misunderstand what resilience actually is. It's not the dramatic moment where you prove everyone wrong. It's the 100 quiet mornings before that, when you show up anyway. When you sand the same joint for the 4th time because it isn't right yet and nobody is watching and nobody would know if you skipped it. That's where character gets built, not in front of an audience. I didn't tell my family about the Chicago projects or the waiting list or Foster flying to Columbus because I needed to protect something. Not a secret, something more fragile than that. The version of myself that was still figuring out if this was real. The moment you hand something unfinished to someone who doesn't believe in it, it becomes harder to believe in it yourself. I had to let it become solid first. That took time. That took patience I didn't know I had until I needed it. My grandfather used to say that good work is its own argument. He didn't mean it arrogantly. He meant that if you do something with enough integrity, for long enough, the truth of it eventually becomes undeniable. Not because you forced it, but because that's just how honest work moves through the world. Courtney finding out at that dinner table wasn't luck. It was 3 years of showing up, doing the work correctly, treating every commission like it mattered, until the work found its own way into a room I was already sitting in. The moment my dad said we should come see the workshop, just that, nothing more, I understood something about patience and people that I hadn't understood before. You cannot rush someone into seeing you clearly. You can only keep being worth seeing. Warren is a man who respects results because that's how he was built, and I spent years resenting that about him. But at that table, I realized I'd given him something he could actually hold. Not an explanation, not a defense, just proof. And proof, offered quietly and without anger, the something that arguments never can. I'm not saying everything is fixed. Families don't work that way. But something moved that night. Something that had been load-bearing weight became, just slightly, a door. If there's anything I'd say to someone sitting in their own version of that workshop right now, invisible and underfunded and tired of explaining themselves to people who aren't listening yet, it's this. The work is the answer. Not the speech. Not the moment at the dinner table. The work you do in the dark before anyone cares is the only thing that makes the moment at the table possible. Integrity over time is not a strategy. It's just the only thing that's actually real. Build the thing. Do it right. Let it speak for itself. It always does, eventually.